Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Cliveden in the pouring rain. It's lovely to see such a big crowd for this event. This is our guest, Robert Harris. Needs little introduction. He's the author of many novels which you would have read about the Second World War. Can you hear?
I think it needs to be in the centre of your...
How's that? Is that better? Robert Harris, we know him for many of his novels about the Second World War, Fatherland, Enigma, Munich, about ancient Rome with the Cicero trilogy, about Dreyfus, and he's written contemporary thrillers too, like Conclave, which is coming out as a film shortly, starring Ralph Fiennes. Is that right?
It is, and Stanley Tucci,
and
John Lithgow, and Isabella Rossellini as the nun.
Well, that's something to contemplate. Now for something different. We're on to the First World War. This is Robert's 16th novel. It's called Precipice, and it's a novel about the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, who was the Prime Minister from 1908 to 1916. And I might just inject a personal note here. This novel is of particular interest to me because I'm a descendant of Herbert Asquith. He was my grandmother's grandfather, so I was particularly interested to see this new take on this mythical figure from my childhood, who my grandmother cast him in a slightly different light, let's say, to the way that you've cast him. So, Robert, can we talk about Herbert Asquith? First of all, he's not really somebody... I mean, I think I'm right in saying he was the longest-serving Prime Minister of the 20th century after Maggie, after Margaret Thatcher, but yet we don't know that much about him. He's not much written about, is he? What led you to decide to explore his story and to write about him?
Well, it's a long kind of story, really. About 10 years ago, Margot Asquith's wartime journals were published, which were terrific and gossipy and fascinating. And I read Violet Bonham Carter, his daughter's journals and letters also. And I started to think maybe I could do a sort of saga, a Forsyte saga about the Asquith family, and there are so many descendants of Asquith that I could have just made a living just selling it to them, I think, actually. Everywhere I've gone in the last 2 years, there's been descendants of Asquiths have popped out of every corner.
With varying reactions to your work.
Yes, and at any rate, so I thought of that originally, and then I thought that maybe that wouldn't work. But the story of his affair with Venetia Stanley kept drawing me back, and I wanted to write a novel about a prime minister, what it's like to be a prime minister with things crossing their desk and making their decisions, and whether I could do that fictionally. And I wanted to write a novel with a strong central female figure in the novel. And I suddenly realised that I could do it about these two. I could have a real-life Prime Minister in 1914-15 grappling with unimaginable problems crossing his desk, and he wrote 560 letters to Venetia. She must have written 300 or 350 back, and he burnt them all. She preserved all of his letters, and he burnt all of hers. So I thought, well, I can write her letters, her replies, and in that way start to conjure her, bring her back to life.
So you've recreated this, what one could call a love story, with one set of letters intact and one set of letters completely imagined, the ones that she wrote. You had to get inside her mind, and did you find that difficult?
Well, if I'm honest, I didn't particularly. The things she actually wrote are suggested by Asquith's replies. He would refer to something that she'd said, maybe even quote a few words. Her granddaughter was Anna Matthias, was extremely helpful to me, and I read other letters that Venetia had written to other people, and began to get her voice. And we know quite a few things about her. She was a society figure. A lot of people knew her, Lady Diana Cooper. She was Clementine Churchill's first cousin, bridesmaid at the Churchill's wedding, very well connected, not highly educated at all, didn't go to school even, but clever. And I found her a sympathetic character, actually,
yes.
and I enjoyed writing her part.
And I want to explore their relationship in more depth. But before we do that, tell me about Herbert Asquith, his story. He was born in, the 1850s? From a fairly modest background.
Born in 1852. His father was in the textile business. He died quite young, and Asquith was still a schoolboy, and he was packed off to London, stayed with various families in Pimlico and Islington. It seems to be a rather miserable childhood. He doesn't seem to have had much of a relationship with his mother. There's a rather telling anecdote that he lodged with a family of Puritan chemists, which sounds a doubly alarming, in Islington, and he used to sneak out. He was forbidden to go to the theatre, but he used to sneak out when he was about 14 and queue for hours to see actresses. I mean, there was something about women he found very alluring, particularly if they were sort of out of reach. There was a streak of melancholy in him. Anyway, he was brilliant. He was probably the cleverest man intellectually who was ever Prime Minister. Went to Balliol, President of the Union, won all the prizes, became a lawyer, was handpicked by Gladstone very early and was promoted from the backbenchers to be Home Secretary. And so he went on and became Prime Minister in 1908. He dispatched business very effectively and quickly. And used it, and for his leisure time, he played a lot of bridge, socialised a lot, drank a lot, was known as Squiffy or yep. Squiff. But this doesn't seem to have harmed his ability to be Prime Minister. Bonner Law, the Tory leader, complained to the Chief Whip that the trouble is Asquith drunk is better than any of our side sober. So he had great mastery both over the House of Commons and over an incredibly talented cabinet, Churchill, Lloyd George, Haldane, and later Kitchener. I mean, and he presided with Balliol effortless superiority over this lot. And in peacetime, he was very formidable. In war, a lot of these virtues or characteristics turned against him. He loved a round of golf at the weekends, and the very funny letter that he wrote to Venetia saying that he always liked to go to the country at weekends during the war, and as he was driving back with Lady Tree from playing a round of golf, she said to him, "Tell me, Mr. Asquith, do you take an interest in the war at all?" And he, to his credit, told this story against himself, where he wrote to Venetia and said, rather sharp, I thought.
So here we are at the beginning of your novel, Precipice, in the summer of 1914. He's facing big problems in Ireland. The war is almost something that seems to creep up on him, and creep up on the government, and creep on the country. Can you just talk us through the
British establishment's political class's main concern in July 1914 was Ireland and the possibility of civil war in Ireland. There'd been the Curragh mutiny earlier in the year, where British soldiers had seemed to refuse to take arms against the Ulstermen. And he had taken over as Secretary of State for War as well as being Prime Minister. That's how dominant he was. And the Liberal government was propped up by Irish nationalists and Labour MPs. It was a minority government. And the time had finally come when the Irish nationalists were insisting that Home Rule was introduced. And he had to introduce the Home Rule Bill. It was clear that Ulster would fight and the Tories would back the Ulstermen. And the country appeared on the brink of civil war, not European war, but civil war. And when the European crisis blew up at the end of July 1914, there was a feeling that in some circles that it was a bit of a relief. This would be a distraction, at least, from the imminent laying of the Home Rule Bill. And Venetia wrote to him and said, that's like curing a headache by cutting off your head. And he actually quotes those lines in a letter to her. And I think that gives you a flavour of her cleverness and shrewdness and wit, really.
So one begins to see a relationship and a connection which perhaps wasn't available to him through his wife, Margot. Would you say that was
Yeah, Margot was his second wife. He'd married a local doctor's daughter, who he was devoted to, Helen Mellon, in the 19th century. She died very young, leaving him with 5 young children. Yeah. He remarried to Margot Tennant, daughter of the richest man in Scotland, and through her really entered high society. He was, I think, clearly besotted with her to begin with, but she used to call herself the Prime Ministress, and would talk to his colleagues behind his back, and she was to the right of him politically, and he used to say that a conversation with her was like having a Morning Post leader shouted at you. And after he became Prime Minister, she had 2 children,
Elizabeth and Puffin, is that right?
Yes, who survived, but she had a lot of miscarriages and stillbirths, and she was told in no uncertain terms that the next pregnancy would kill her. So they slept apart, and that aspect of the marriage seems to have stopped, and you can start to see how Venetia started to supplant her.
So he's in his 60s.
She's at 61 at the opening of the novel. She's 26.
She's 26, and they're part of this world, which this rather sort of gilded world, pre-war, Edwardian.
Yes, in a way, the novel's called Precipice because
it's the end of something, isn't it?
Yes, a whole society, a whole ordered, settled, privileged way of life. When it's hard to believe sitting in Cliveden, but
it's back.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm glad it's kept going here. But for most of those very rich families, that it was to come to an end, really, in 1914. It no longer became viable to run houses such as this.
And the strange thing to me is this relationship carried out kind of in open and kind of in secret. There seems to be this odd thing where she's receiving 3 letters a day from the Prime Minister and going on these drives. Just tell us about the drives they would go on.
The drives have got me into a lot of trouble. Well, got me into more trouble than it got Asquith, ironically. Yes, so the relationship really got going beginning of 1914 and extended through into 1915. He liked to wake up to a letter from her on his bedside table in number 10. He would write to her at the end of the morning, generally before lunch, and tell her what had happened in cabinet, and maybe send her a few secret documents, which he often did. Then in the afternoon, at the end of the afternoon, early evening, he would write to her again. Often he would do this from the Athenaeum, from his club. Again, secret documents, again, cabinet secrets, put in the club letterbox. There were 12 deliveries a day in London.
Very, very efficient mail system, wasn't it?
Pre-Paula Vennell's days of the post office. So they kept in regular touch, and they would meet at Downing Street at lunches or dinners, or at her parents' or other mutual friends. And the time alone was chiefly a drive every week, normally on a Friday afternoon, normally for an hour and a half or so. They would head out drive up to Hampstead Heath or out to the Chilterns or the Thames Valley. And
what happened at the car?
When I was prepared to swallow the line that this was a purely fantasy relationship on the part of Asquith, that it was a distraction. As Roy Jenkins says, no more of a distraction, Venetia, to him than hymn singing was to Lloyd George. Okay, fair enough. It doesn't bother me. And then I had to write this scene of the Prime Minister picking her up from her house near Portland Place. And I thought, what car is he in? Well, I better describe it in some way. And it was a 1908 Napier 45 horsepower, 6-cylinder limousine. And by chance, one had been sold by Bonhams at auction about 5 years previously, and a film of it was on YouTube in an American female AI-generated or computer-generated voice. And so I sat and watched this. In the Napier, the passengers were separated from the chauffeur by a fixed glass screen with curtains. Communication with the driver was via a push-button console which lit up instructions on the dashboard. There were blinds on all the other windows. So suddenly an hour and a half journey in this car began to make a kind of sense to me. Because Asquith was notoriously unsafe in the back of cars, his own or anyone else's for that matter. And he had a group of young female admirers who Margot derisively called the harem.
So there were ones before Venetia?
There were ones before Venetia and there were ones after Venetia, but Venetia was the central affair of his life. And I think to try and think there wasn't some physical component to this is strains credulity. It would mean she was the only woman in London on whom he'd never tried it on, and that doesn't seem likely.
But we don't know.
We don't know.
We'll never know the extent.
We don't. Let's not go into that. But I think that I don't think there was any danger of her getting pregnant. I mean, at that time there wasn't much birth control, and the commonest form of contraception, if I can put it this way, what they used to call it, leaving the church before the sermon. A delicate way of putting it. I doubt whether it even got that far, to be perfectly honest. There's a lot of references in his letters to her that he misses the touch of her hand, and maybe we should just leave it at that.
Right.
The other very amusing thing about these car journeys, and this is the other reason I wanted to write the book, or gave me a way to write the book, was that in August 1914, about 10 days after the war had started, he writes to Venetia and says, my darling, a very funny thing just happened. Sir Edward Grey, one of whose descendants, incidentally, reviewed the novel, so, you know, I've got it covered on all sides. Sir Edward Grey has just sent round a locked box containing the torn-up fragments, screwed-up fragments of Foreign Office flimsies, which have been discovered by the members of the public in various places.
Can you tell us what a flimsy was?
A flimsy, you remember carbon copies with and the onion skin paper that you got as a result. But these were decrypted ambassadorial telegrams from Berlin, St. Petersburg, Vienna, and Grey said to Asquith, if the Germans get hold of these, this will compromise our ciphers. And only 5 men received these. That's me, Asquith, Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, and Harcourt, the Colonial Secretary. And he wanted an explanation from his 4 colleagues, which of them was responsible for littering the countryside with these top-secret documents. And of course it was Asquith who used to, whatever else was going on in the car, he also used to share all these papers and then throw them out of the window. And he said to her, fortunately, the pieces of evidence did not contain the flimsy you told me off about for throwing out of the window when we drove down Roehampton Lane on Saturday. Therefore, I pleaded not guilty. Well, when I read this, I thought there was a leak inquiry of a sort. I mean, these had been handed into local police and they'd gone to Scotland Yard, and Scotland Yard had come to the Foreign Office. And I thought the character who had to carry out the investigation would be an interesting person to put in the novel.
So he's your way into the narrative.
He's a way in for us, the modern reader.
A young policeman on the rise.
Ordinary copper, as it were, whose brother is in the army, and who is assigned to this case, and he sort of starts to discover things, and that was a way of me introducing the letters and the way that the whole affair developed, because he sent her letters from Lord Kitchener, a letter from the Queen. These are all among the papers lodged in the Bodleian. When the British Army, which had been placed on the Belgian border, found itself in grave jeopardy because of the nearly 1 million Germans sweeping across Belgium, Sir John French sent an urgent top-secret message, encrypted obviously, to Asquith, saying, heavy fighting, we need to withdraw. I propose to draw back, to retreat to the line, and then he gave the 3 towns to which the British Army would be retreating. And Asquith, within an hour, put this in the open post to Venetia, who was staying with her parents near Holyhead. So it was quite an extraordinary, given that this man had introduced the Official Secrets Act in 1911, it is quite mind-blowing, really.
Can you explain it? I find it very hard to fathom.
Well,
why he would do something so
I think there are various explanations. One is he genuinely, I think, wanted to share his life with her. He wanted her to know everything that he was seeing. Because he wanted to talk to her about it. I'm not saying that she was sort of running the government, saying, oh, I think that Sir John French is retreating to the wrong towns or something, but he wanted to be able to bounce...
To unburden himself off somebody.
Yes, and she needed to be in the know for him to be able to do that effectively. I think there was an element probably of showing off also.
Yes, trying to impress her. There's a good line also in your novel where he talks about being in the House and all the Liberal MPs filing past, none of whom he can really... They're all either disappointed or on the make, and as a Prime Minister you're constantly in the business of letting people down because you can't promote them as much as they want to do. And so probably the loneliness of power is one.
Yes, I think so. I mean, his two closest friends of government were Haldane and Sir Edward Grey, but I think even with them, he was careful about what he told them. I mean, he had to be careful in that aspect, at least. And Venetia, who didn't have the vote, who was clever and attractive and quick, but outside any political apparatus, was someone he could talk to. And I can kind of sort of understand that, as well as this fissure within him, emotional fissure, that he needed to be in love, I think, perhaps. He needed this thing in his life. He's a romantic, in a sense. Yes, coupled with, as I say, this predilection for a hand on the knee or a hand around the waist or whatever. Well,
and also has a sense of a man sort of declining, a man on the turn in terms of melancholy, energy, sort of disappointment. There's a feeling I got from the novel that he wasn't really happy and wanted an escape at some subliminal level.
Well, I mean, he's 61 at the start of the novel. He'll be 62. He has his 62nd birthday during it. I mean, that's 10 years older than us, really, at least. I mean, in terms of how long people live now. I think he was doing the calculations. His father had died young. He probably realised he didn't have that long left. And I think that he even talked of eloping with her. He had romantic fantasies about her. And when he thought that, of course, this became incredibly heavy for her. I mean, it became, what had been exciting, I think, became deeply tedious. Yeah. When he sensed her drawing apart, he talked of his depression to her and even said that he wished he could die. So it was, I think he was feeling his mortality, and I think to have been Prime Minister at such a tumultuous time, and now to face this huge war.
And for a long time.
Yes.
Was it 8 years? So 6 years by that stage.
Yes, I made a film. I was then a reporter for Panorama when Margaret Thatcher overtook his record as the longest-serving Prime Minister of the 20th century. So the record stood for a long time. And these were huge years of social upheaval, industrial strife, row over suffragettes, reform of the House of Lords, and all the introduction of social legislation, rise of the Labour Party. I mean, when one looks back on it, one thinks of the period of Edwardian calm, but of course, beneath the glittering surface, it was anything but.
And the other fascinating thing about that time, and perhaps he was the last example of it, was the relative anonymity of the Prime Minister. He goes off to get a haircut when he's walking around the House of Commons by himself and just wanders down to get a haircut, and then he goes off to a bookshop in the middle of the day and has a little doze in an armchair. And it seems and then he stops on the road because somebody's broken down and helps them get their car going.
He did.
And they never
They didn't know who he was, this man in a big car.
So it's rather charming, very peculiar idea to us that the Prime Minister can be this sort of citizen and he goes up, takes the train to Holyhead by himself. And
yes, and he takes the train to Audley Edge, where the family had a huge house. He took 4 days off in October 1914 just to travel up and see her, and he took no secretary and no bodyguard. He travelled around without a detective, except when he went to Ireland.
Even when he became the Prime Minister, he went down to Biarritz on his own to get the King's...
Yes, briefly during the suffragette era, he was attacked by suffragettes, so then he had to have a police escort. But otherwise, he lived completely like a normal citizen. And because at the beginning of the war, his picture did begin to appear in the papers or on the early newsreels, he found himself, to his horror, being followed back from Westminster by what he called a crowd of loafers who recognised him. And they were all very friendly, but he couldn't stand it, the idea of being recognised in the street. He used to hail a cab back from one of the frequent dinner parties he attended and would say, "Take me to Downing Street." And the cabbie wouldn't know who he was and wouldn't know what Downing Street was. It was not and nobody really went there very much. Yeah. I mean, it was extraordinary. There's an empire of 450 million people. And in the novel, I think rightly, I say it's a slight point of pride to him that the head of this huge, powerful, arguably just about the most powerful country in the world, could travel around in this way.
Yes, and then lots of country house weekends, no sense of a 24/7 life. And even in the build-up to the war, he was still heading off for a bit of
oh yes,
downtime.
One of the things was Venetia and her family used to go to this house in Wales, remote, hundreds of miles from London, a beautiful house, and he often used to go and stay there, and he was planning to go just as war was declared, and he was still dreaming of going there sort of 2 days before the war started. When the war started, he's even more stuck in London. And an example of Venetia's letters to him, he said, "Thank you, darling, for your letter, the delicious lines from the sonnet. I do so agree with you about dull substance." So using Google, yet again, I see my research level here, I put in sonnet, dull substance, and this is Shakespeare's 44th sonnet, which is a rather erotic, metaphysical kind of sonnet about if only our thoughts were our bodies, this dull substance would not come between us. And at any rate, he was determined to get over this dull substance, and so he conceived the idea, about 10 days after the war started, of giving a morale-boosting speech in each of the 4 capitals of the United Kingdom. He gave one in London, he gave one in Edinburgh, he had one scheduled in Cardiff, and he had to go and speak in Dublin. And this whole tour had been designed so that he went to Dublin and could stop in Holyhead on the way out and on the way back. Quite extraordinary. And I couldn't resist putting in the novel that Churchill sends a destroyer to escort the Irish ferry from in case of German submarines. And Asquith reflects it did seem to have caused an awful lot of trouble to an awful lot of people just so that he could see Venetia.
And even see her, go for a walk with her for half an hour.
Yes.
I mean, it's not even seeing her much because of the other people around them. They're always struggling to find moments when they could be alone.
Yes, and there was certainly something happened that particular weekend, because something happened in a hollow, a sort of culvert or something, yes, looking out to sea in the woods, which he referred to several times in letters afterwards, our delicious half hour, and then again sitting out on a bench under the stars that night. So it was a passionate kind of relationship, I think, almost certainly.
And as you say, it turns through the course of your novel from this passionate relationship into something where his neediness and her weariness seem to come to the fore, and
yes,
it gets difficult.
Yes, I think that, to begin with, I think she was flattered by the attentions of the Prime Minister. Hers was a political family. Her father had been a Liberal MP. It was an intellectual family. Her father had been a Don at Oxford and had lost his job because he announced he was an atheist. His elder brother, from whom he eventually inherited the title, was converted to Islam and sat in the House of Lords as a Muslim peer. And another brother, the younger brother, was a Roman Catholic bishop. So they were related to Bertrand Russell. They were really in a kind of, that was the kind of family that they were. And I think that it flattered her that she would sit at dinner knowing, probably more than any other woman in the country, more than most prime ministers, certainly more than the king, who hardly got any news of what was going on in cabinet compared to what she did, that she was in this position. So that flattered her. And then I think that when the war started, I think she decided that something she could do, her contribution in a sense, would be to keep his morale high, to keep him happy.
Yes.
But then, as the war turned bad, as the crisis grew, as the casualty lists extended, as the sons of his friends were killed, I think he found the pressure huge. And he was not a military man like Kitchener or Churchill.
Yes, he wasn't cut out to lead a war.
He wasn't. He had to make decisions, and I don't think he really knew which was the right one to make. Yeah. And he became more and more needy. The pace of the letter writing increased, sometimes up to 4,000 words a day. And in very secretive, sensitive meetings, and I think it became too much for her, almost certainly. And he sensed that she was pulling away. At one point, I have him say, if only neediness were attractive, the world would be a more happy place, which is probably true. And anyway, what is interesting is the extent to which she had a political impact because of this. And that's an area of controversy. There's no doubt that he wrote to her during cabinet meetings, and a crucial war cabinet meeting.
Is this the Dardanelles?
Yes, on the 13th of January 1915, when they were casting around as to what British strategy should be. Now they had these huge Kitchener armies. Where would they send them? What would they do in 1915? This was a meeting of the senior cabinet ministers, the service chiefs and top brass, and certainly Balfour was there for the Tories. And the meeting went on for about 4 hours, almost an all-day meeting. And at 3:30, he says, he's in the meeting, he said, "Darling, your sweetest, delicious letter has just arrived. I'll pick you up from Cynthia's on Tuesday." "Oh no, now I see, I'm looking at it, I've got the wrong Tuesday. It'll be the following Tuesday." And on it goes like this. And then he says, 4 p.m, Winston still talking. Very interesting. I'll tell you all about it when I see you. Well, this was the first kind of serious rollout of the Dardanelles operation.
Which was a catastrophe.
Which, yes, went badly wrong because it couldn't be a purely naval operation, as they increasingly discovered. Maybe it didn't affect his judgment, maybe things would have gone on as before, but certainly he wasn't giving it his full attention. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, and this was a key moment in the war.
It was, yes, it was the beginning of what was to prove a calamitous operation that cost the British alone 32,000 dead.
Yeah. So it's kind of terrible, right? I mean, it's unthinkable that this could happen.
Yes, I mean, as I say, it's possible that the operation would have gone ahead, but it's also possible that if he'd had his wits about him, he might have interrogated the Admiralty more closely about, can this really be done with 20 ships or whatever they would say.
One of the other interesting things I found about your novels was the characters around him. Churchill seemed to be crazed for war.
He was open about his excitement about the possibility of war.
Yes, and then you have Kitchener and you have Lloyd George, who's sort of double-dealing.
Lloyd George was opposed and then came round to it. Like three-quarters of the Liberal Party, Asquith estimated, were against the war, but everything changed with the German invasion of Belgium.
Yeah.
A very interesting character for me to write was Kitchener, who's really his reputation is pretty low, but possibly because he was drowned in 1916 and wasn't around to write his memoirs or defend his corner. Frankly, that's how politics is. And he was the only one. Everyone really did think, or most people do seem to have said, the war would have to end by Christmas. The nations couldn't sustain the war much longer than that. And Kitchener was the only person that I came across who said, when asked how long the war would go on, he said, "Oh, it won't end until 1917 at the earliest."
So,
and there was this astonishment, and he said, "Well, we'll need to raise an army of 2 million men, and that will take us at least 3 years." So 1917, and not many other, well, in fact, I didn't come across anyone else who put it in such stark and prescient terms. But he was an very interesting man to write about. He didn't want to be Secretary of State for War at all, and he had to be ordered off a ferry. He was trying to escape back to Egypt, where he was Consul General, a much more agreeable post than taking over the British Army in 1914.
And what did you make of Grey and the other? How did the dynamic work in Cabinet?
Well, the Grey had kind of got us slightly entangled with France, with guarantees, not treaty guarantees, but undertakings of what we would do in the event of war. And Grey would have resigned if the British hadn't fought. He made that clear. And what Asquith has to do at the beginning of the war, and really does quite brilliantly, is hold the government together. I mean, he genuinely thought, I think it's the Sunday before war, that by the evening he would be tendering his resignation. That he thought half the cabinet would vote against it, and he could never get it through the House of Commons. And that Grey would go, and if Grey went, he would have to go, and so the whole thing would collapse. But he managed to hold it together, and that is almost the last moment when we glimpsed the formidable Asquith.
Yeah.
The Asquith who dominated the Commons and his party.
And talk us through what happens after that.
Well, then the army is sent, and then there's a dispute, an interesting dispute, which I wasn't aware of until I wrote the novel. The General Staff wanted to put the British Expeditionary Force on the Belgian border, so it could play a full part early, and Kitchener wanted to keep it back near Amiens, near Paris, to come in as this kind of second wave. And Asquith had to adjudicate between the two and came down on the side of the General Staff, which was a mistake. And so at the end of August, there was an enormous feeling of suddenly the country woke up one Sunday to the fact that the army might actually be either wiped out or forced to do a Dunkirk-style evacuation. Yeah. And there was a special edition of the Times for the first time ever on a Sunday with, for the first time ever, news on the front page. It was a sort of stunning moment for the country, and that's really when everything sort of begins.
And then you have...
Then you have stalemate, you have this crazy kind of Ostend, Antwerp operation, in which Asquith's son gets caught up in.
Yes, Ock.
Ock, who became a great soldier, actually.
Yes.
And so they, you know, you had that, and then you had to settle down. The Schieffelin plan failed. The Germans couldn't take Paris, and as Churchill said, it was then a matter of the two armies chewing barbed wire. And then you have the armaments crisis. And then there's the armaments crisis, which again, Venetia is an important part of, because, well, nobody knew what kind of war this would be, and whenever you tried to advance, I mean, French fired off a kind of 17 days worth of total British shell production in one morning, practically, Neuve-Chapelle, and the story began to leak out that there weren't enough shells to take on the Germans, and Asquith asked for a report, and Kitchener spoke to Sir John French, the commander, and he sent a very brief memo to Asquith saying, "Have spoken to French. He says he has enough shells for his next attack." Asquith immediately, within the hour, put this in an envelope and sent it to Venetia to add to her collection of secret documents. And 10 days later,
the only copy.
Unbelievable.
The only copy.
The only copy. Things were done differently in those days. And she received this, and he, 10 days later or so, spoke to 5,000 munitions workers in Newcastle, which was the great centre of armaments production, and said in a hugely reported speech that it was totally untrue that there'd ever been any shortage of ammunition. I mean, he was speaking to munitions workers. This is what they wanted to hear. And the next day he was given a pasting in the papers. And, of course, he'd misremembered the Kitchener...
The report?
Yes. Kitchener had said, French says he had enough shells for his next attack. Not that there'd never been a shell crisis, or there might not be a crisis in the future. And the editors of the letters of Asquith, they published about half of them about 40 years ago, say, and I think it's true, that this was the greatest mistake of his entire premiership. It was one of those phrases
it's a colossal mistake,
hung around his neck. And it seems to have escaped historians' notice that Venetia had the crucial memo. He didn't have it. He got it back in about 1920 or 1921, I think. Post-war, when he was having to deal with French's memoirs. Yes. He wanted to rebut what he was claiming.
So we're painting a picture of gross incompetence, or gross negligence.
I mean, I've tried to be sympathetic to him. I am quite sympathetic to him, and I know a lot of people are kind of appalled at the very notion of a man in his position having an affair with a young woman who had been a close friend of his daughter's. But you can't really write novels as polemics, you know, about our conventional morality. So I tried to avoid that. I just sort of laid out what happened.
And without wishing to condone the behaviour, he wasn't the only one. I mean, Lloyd George was...
Oh, Lloyd George was far worse.
Yes.
I mean, these two side by side in Downing Street is quite staggering, actually, that any work was done of any sort.
But the... yes, it strikes me as extraordinary that somebody could make such terrible mistakes at such human cost.
Well, they didn't know what they were doing, I think, to be honest. The only experience that suggested what might happen in the First World War was the American Civil War, which I believe it's still the case that it killed more American soldiers than every other war America has ever fought in. First, Second, Vietnam, Iraq. It cost between 600 and 700,000 lives, and that was because of railways and advances in machine guns and the kind of well, at any rate, the kind of artillery and small arms they had, and that had greatly advanced by 1914. So it was a slaughterhouse, and I don't think anyone knew how to deal with it or cope with it. And it turned out that you could turn around a huge economy like the British to the manufacture of vast amounts of armaments. And the Germans could do the same, and the French, and the whole thing just just became a mincing machine.
And is there a parallel universe, a parallel world, of which you specialise in, where things could have been different, where war could have been avoided? I mean, the Belgium seems to be the moment when we're drawn in. But if you think of the 1870 war, we didn't get involved.
No, we didn't. So, didn't send a single British soldier to that.
Could anything else have happened, irrespective of Asquith and Venetia?
I think that it was. I think I'm right. In 1870, the Germans didn't go through Belgium. I mean, they wanted to knock out the French quickly and transfer their troops to the Eastern Front to deal with Russia. So it was a different kind of, almost a world war scenario, though we started to look at. And I think there were two considerations. One is the threat to the Channel and to the Royal Navy being bottled up, and the other was to the whole imperial myth that we could dominate this enormous patch of the world because of a myth of superiority, which would have been completely punctured if we had ducked the challenge. And we did have some treaty obligations to Belgium, and actually the whole mood of the House of Commons switched overnight. And I think that Asquith might have lost office for the other reason, for not going to war. So it's one of those things. Of course, anyone with hindsight would say, don't, for God's sake, do that. I mean, it not only was a terrible, appalling incident and a slaughter of 4 years in its own right, but of course it laid the ground for the Russian Revolution, the rise of fascism, Nazism, and eventually the whole thing being fought again in 1939. So, no, it was clearly, it would have been great to have avoided it, but, I think at the time, it strikes me as unavoidable. I know some historians take a different view, but...
And is your perception of the accounts of Asquith that have been written for you, were they complete? They clearly weren't.
No.
I mean, Roy Jenkins wrote about Asquith.
Well, for me, this is very interesting, because I got to know Venetia Stanley's granddaughter, and she knows really how the letters... She has correspondence, so we know that Venetia died in 1948, having kept this archive completely intact. Asquith must have known she had all these letters. In fact, she used to talk about it. They used to talk about how they would read them together, years on. He never asked for them back, as far as we know. So, at any rate, there they were, this extraordinary intact archive, discovered by her daughter, her one daughter, Judy, after her mother's death. She thought of writing a book herself about the letters, and she showed them to Mark Bonham Carter, the grandson of Asquith, who had a transcript made of all about a third of a million words, and he showed it to Roy Jenkins. And there was a big fear, because after the First World War, Venetia was the mistress of Lord Beaverbrook, and he clearly knew all about the letters and used to, with a twinkle in his eye, suggest that he might run an exclusive in the Sunday Express, which the family were very worried about. And so the letters were given to Roy. Violet Bonham Carter, the daughter of Asquith, really did not want them to be used at all. She must have really wanted to destroy them, but she couldn't. She was horrified to find out what had happened between Asquith and Venetia. And it was her
friend.
Yeah, and she felt sorry for Margot for the first time in her life. They did not get on. But anyway, with reluctance, she gave permission that a Bowdlerized form of the letters could be used by Roy Jenkins. But they don't include any of the endearments, and he uses them really as a kind of diary, so that, you know, it's biographical gold dust to know where someone is all the time and their judgments of meetings and colleagues. And then a scholarly edition of the letters came out in 1982, beautifully, brilliantly edited, but with, one senses the shadow of the Bonham Carters still, who controlled the literary copyright over it.
Roy was
Roy
very close to the Bonham Carters.
You can say that again.
Let's not go there.
Yeah, we'll keep off that. But the thing that's really stunned me was the attempt by writers like Stephen Cost to say that Venetia was not important in the fact that eventually the Liberal government was wound up by Asquith. That, and she broke off with him on the sort of Wednesday, and on the Friday, Admiral Fisher resigned as First Sea Lord, prompting a huge crisis, because by now the Dardanelles was really turning into a nightmare. And the shell crisis resurfaced in the Times that same Friday morning. This is a double blow, and there was an absolutely sulphurous meeting of the War Council where everyone turned on Churchill and he fought back.
And Northcliffe is part of this.
And Northcliffe was undermining the government. And Asquith was heartbroken by the fact that he couldn't speak to Venetia. He wrote a sort of agonized letter, "This breaks my heart." And he was trying to cope with this crisis as well as dealing with his own emotional turmoil. And on the Monday, after the Fisher resignation on the Friday, he was given a brutal démarche by Lloyd George, who said, "I've got Bonner Law sitting in number 11 Downing Street. I want to bring him in now, and we'll have a coalition government." And whether Asquith could have called his bluff or what, we will never know. But he folded immediately, and there was, and Bonner Law duly walked through the connecting door. And it's suggested that Venetia, the disappearance of Venetia from his life, had no direct influence on
the timing suggests something.
Yes, and I was having to write this scene, and I went to the very detailed, masterly but completely unread Martin Gilbert Official Life of Winston Churchill, where there is a passage describing Fisher's resignation. And it's clear that in 1971, the book was published in 71, Gilbert had been given access to the Venetia Stanley collection of Asquith's letters. And there is the only place that I've ever seen the crucial 2 paragraphs in Asquith's letter to Venetia that morning that he agreed to the coalition that I've never seen published anywhere else, and they're missed out of the letters published by OUP. And indeed, I don't think I'll be giving anything away if I just read this last, the book ends with this letter. So this part is what Asquith wrote to her that morning. "Darling, your most revealing and heart-rending letter has just come. What am I to say? What can I say? I was able to keep silence for the 2 most miserable days of my life, and then it became unbearable. And like you, I felt that it was cruel and unnatural, and that anything was better. So I scrawled my 2 or 3 agonized sentences, and thank God you once more speak to me, and I to you." That's printed in the OUP. This is not. "Never since the war began had I such an accumulation, no longer shared, of anxieties. One of the most hellish bits of these most hellish days was that you alone of all the world, to whom I have always gone in every moment of trial and trouble, and from whom I have always come back solaced and healed and inspired, were the one person who could do nothing, and from whom I could ask nothing. To my dying day, that will be the most bitter memory of my life. I am on the eve of the most astounding and world-shaking decisions, such as I would never have taken without your counsel and consent. It seems so strange and empty and unnatural, yet there is nowhere else that I can go, nor would I if I could." I mean, it's hard to believe that her disappearance wasn't a factor in the decision to offer half the seats in the cabinet to the Conservative Party, and there was never a Liberal government again in this country. So I say in the book, she was one of the most consequential women in British political life, I think.
Yes. Now, I want to open the talk up to questions, please, from the audience. Please put your hands up. Here we go. Let's start here. You and Relly.
Thank you. Thanks for a great talk. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. Do you, as an author in that situation, is there any of you in the story you tell of Asquith? You're clearly trying to be sympathetic towards him. Do you give him the same reactions maybe that you would have? How much of you is in him in the book?
None, I think. I mean, I don't think that I find it stunning that he behaved as he did. But he was a Victorian. He was the last of the great Victorians, I think. Born in 1852, he was out of his time. There were instincts of him that I greatly do applaud. I mean, he was the one who introduced old age pensions. It's often ascribed to Lloyd George, but it was Asquith. He was appalled. He was a genuine Gladstonian liberal. He was appalled at the roundup of 40,000 foreign nationals, after the sinking of the Lusitania. He thought he was the wrong man for the wrong time, I think. And being a novelist, I think you have to inhabit all your characters. You have to feel sympathy in some sense for all of them. And it's not, I don't feel it's my job to sort of lay out a moral charge against him. It would have been very easy to write a Me Too kind of book about Asquith. But I didn't think that was what I wanted to do.
Any other questions? Here we go. Just a few rows back.
Thank you. A brilliant talk. I wanted to ask you, did Asquith work less hard than other Edwardians of the time? I mean, it seems extraordinary that one could be Prime Minister and do so little, and obviously during the war it didn't work. Beforehand, did he work hard enough?
I think he was always regarded as, well, what is the phrase about Balliol? Effortless superiority. I think that it was almost an affectation that he appeared to have plenty of time. He dispatched business with great efficiency. He had an absolute Rolls-Royce mind, and he took decisions very quickly. He was had an optimistic nature. He liked to procrastinate, however. His most famous phrase is "wait and see," which has always seemed to me quite a good phrase, actually. And it might be a good idea if more politicians took a bit longer to, wait and see how things develop rather than immediately rushing in and doing something. But he did have a reputation around that time for a certain degree of indolence. But I don't think anyone thought he was ineffective, both in the House of Commons and on the public platform. He was a formidable operator. He made his name in some ways by pursuing Joseph Chamberlain around the country on the issue of free trade and beat him, really, addressing huge audiences. And he was a brilliant debater. So I think he was certainly an effective Prime Minister up until 1914, and then I think the pressure got to him.
Any other questions? One just behind. There we go.
Thanks very much. I'm about a third of the way through your book, and I'm loving it. So thank you for that. What strikes me is the kind of you say that a political leader can't have any friends, and I wonder how much of the relationship with Venetia was because he needed somebody who would be reflective but also non-judgmental about what he was doing. For example, you talk about his 6 principles that he wrote to her for the justification of war, which was, his way of kind of clarifying in his own mind what he was about to do. So my question is, do we expect too much of our leaders in terms of their lack of support in really difficult jobs?
Well, that's very difficult to give an answer to that. I think that as far as his relationship with her goes, as you, in the last 2 paragraphs, make it clear that he'd always gone to her and always come back refreshed, solaced, and so on. What exactly that means? But I think she was genuinely, she raised his spirits, he was in love. And if you're in love with someone, if you see them, you come back feeling happier. And I think I think he was genuinely, immensely besotted with her. And of course, it is difficult for your colleagues do eventually turn on you as Prime Minister, as Margaret Thatcher discovered. People you promoted turn on you. Lloyd George turned on Asquith. Where I think Asquith is culpable, actually, is that unlike Chamberlain, in 1940, he refused to serve under his successor. And Chamberlain, I think, saw that Churchill would be a better war leader, but remained leader of the Tory party and probably hoped to come, well, he did hope to come back again. I mean, impossible, surely, but he did. If Asquith had remained leader of the Liberal Party and served as Lord Chancellor or something under Lloyd George, the whole of British history might have been different. The Labour Party might not have come through. We might have had a political class divided between Liberals and Conservatives. If Asquith had gone to Versailles for the peace conference, he probably would have handled things completely different to Lloyd George. So there is where I think he's culpable, if anywhere, that he sort of resigned in a fit of pique or of outrage. And I think he...
or heartbreak, if one could put it that way.
Well, this was after the affair with Venetia. This was a year and a half later.
Okay.
So he continued in office, but increasingly ineffectively in office.
Yeah. Robert, you're drawn to powerful figures. Where does your interest in power come from?
I think it started in when I was a child. My father had polio when he was 18 months, so he could never really play sport, and he took a great interest in. So I never really did sport with my father. Instead, we used to talk about politics, and he was trade unionist. And the first thing that I ever wrote, really, that was ever given any public airing when I was 6. There was an open day at school, and my parents went down, and all the pupils' work had been pinned up around the walls where we went on holiday, that sort of thing. And mine was why me and my dad don't like Sir Alec Douglas Hume. And as a friend of mine rather cruelly remarked, I've gone on writing that ever since. So I think it started from that. And, you know, it was a kind of football in our household, was politics. And it was fascinating.
Yeah.
You know, this is the days of Wilson and Heath and then Thatcher and so on. And, you know, I always took a great interest in it and read a lot of political biography as well. So, and well, the other thing is I realized I was born only 12 years after the end of the Second World War. And 12 years then seemed a huge amount of time, but it's only as long ago as the London Olympics from now. So there was still a lot of bomb damage, and it dominated everyone's conversation still, and popular culture, you know. So I grew up in the shadow of that as well. So these explain, I think, my twin obsessions.
Yes. Well, Robert, listen, this book is one, I read Precipice in one sitting. It's a fantastic novel. I really recommend it to anyone who's interested in Asquith and the Edwardian period in the beginnings of the First World War. And I commend this book to you. And if you move in an orderly fashion, Robert will be signing copies in Sanders just over there. So please, can we have a big round of applause for Robert Harris? Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.